What's up guys, Dr. D here. Today we're going to be talking about compression, audio compression, and how to use compressors to compress various instruments for different purposes and results. So let's get into it. Okay, cool. So I'm going to use Ableton today to kind of demonstrate this, and we're going to use kick drum track, snare drum track, bass guitar track, and talk about the settings and parameters of a compressor and how to understand those and how to use those and apply those in different contexts. So looking at Ableton here, we have the basic Ableton Live compressor down here, and I've got, this is a kicker, this is a snare track here, and basically we'll talk about what compression is. So compressors, what a compressor does is it's like an automated volume regulator. Okay, so whenever a sound gets loud to a certain level, as it's kind of peaking and popping around on the meters, you can set what's called a threshold, which is a kind of like critical level of the volume, at which when the volume reaches that threshold, it will respond by turning that volume down. Okay, so it's almost like a robot arm on a fader, and every time the sound gets to a certain loudness, the robot fader kind of like turns it down. Now, it can turn it down quick, like it can react very fast initially, and then it recoils at a certain speed. So you have like a time setting, the speed at which it's reacting and turning the sound down, and then you have release, which is the recoil of that compressor. So it turns stuff down either quickly or slowly with a different attack setting, and then the release is how quickly or how slowly it recoils back to zero. Okay, so threshold, we got attack, we got release, and another thing we'll talk about is ratio. Compression ratio is basically, it's a ratio that determines how much gain reduction the compressor is applying as the signal passes through the threshold. So basically, like, a compression setting, ratio setting of 4:1 means that when the volume goes 4 decibels above that threshold level, it's going to turn it down 1 decibel. Okay, so there's kind of a squishiness to it. Like the sound hits that threshold, and then it turns it down like a little bit, not equal. But you can change the ratio setting from 1:1, 2:1, 4:1, 10:1, or infinity to 1, and basically that's how much sound is being reduced when it crosses the threshold. Whether it's totally like all the sound is basically stopped and turned down at a certain level, that's kind of what limiters do. A limiter is a compressor set to infinity to 1 ratio, and then all the things in between it, is kind of like, the compression is happening at a smaller, ratio than what's passing through. So anyway, let's see this stuff in practice. And we got the snare drum track right here, like I said, and the compressor is disabled, and I'm just gonna hit play here, and you've got the snare drum going on. When I turn on the compressor, and as we look at this compressor, and there's like 3 different meters going on here. There is a threshold meter that's marked threshold, but really this is the input signal. There's a this dial in the middle, this meter in the middle is gain reduction. GR stands for gain reduction. Sometimes you'll see this called attenuation. It's another term for the amount of gain that's being reduced. And then there's the output, which is the level of signal going out of the compressor. So the way that you control these things, there's these little sliders here, and basically the threshold is a volume setting that you want to slowly lower to go between the peak volumes. So it's every time a sound hits this threshold level, it meets this point, and it's going to react by turning the sound down, and that's what we see with that gain reduction dial right there, or level right there, popping down in yellow. Okay, so whenever we reduce gain reduction, we're basically losing volume. We can compensate by turning the output gain, or sometimes called makeup gain, up to compensate for the loss in volume. Okay, so most all compressors are going to have a ratio setting like 4-to-1 is kind of like the general setting. You can play with this depending on how much compression you want on an instrument, whether you want it really kind of obvious or not so much. So I'm going to turn mine up a little bit more, maybe 10-to-1, just so we can hear it real good. All right, and now the attack and release. So we get it. Volume is kind of being suppressed, basically, and we can, kind of limit the amount of dynamic range of a track, which makes it easy to balance, right? If a track is not getting louder and softer randomly during the song, and you're kind of like turning the louder things down so the softer stuff is kind of more even, you can basically balance that track a little bit easier with all the other sounds, as well as bring the entire thing up. So if you kind of limit the amount of dynamic range of a track, you have more headroom to bring the volume up so that the track is louder and more powerful. Another thing about it, though, is the attack and release times. Basically what that does is that can carve and shape the envelope. So I'll throw a couple diagrams up here. This one shows how the compressor would react with a fast attack time. So basically the attack of the note, the initial beginning of the sound, is turned down instantly, right? And then the release time that we set, whether the release time is quick or slow, we might set that so that it recoils while the note is kind of dying off, and thus adds kind of a sustain to the note. So sometimes you want to make your notes sustain longer and you want them to be kind of more manageable and less dynamic range. You would do something with like maybe a fast attack and a slower release that kind of extends the end of the note. I do this a lot with basses to get the bass notes to be kind of like really long and kind of like even. Now in a situation where I want more punch, I want something to have more attack, you can have a slower attack time. So in this diagram you see that the attack is kind of it's slower and it's basically coming late to the game. So the sound is getting turned down, but after the initial attack sneaks through and that punch of sound hits you, and then it turns down the back end of the sound, thus making the attack more accentuated. So it's like something has more punch, which is great for a kick drum or a snare drum, maybe for a voice, for the articulation and syllables and hard consonants. Those things will come through a little bit easier in the voice and be easier to hear in the mix. So let's play around with this and see the application of it. So like I was saying, the first thing I always do with the compressor is change the threshold, turn it down until I start getting gain reduction. And I'm looking for a fair amount, maybe like 5 to 10 dB of gain reduction. It's kind of a nice ballpark number for, general. So right here I've got, looks like it's getting closer to 6 or 8. So that's pretty decent. And then depending on what I want to happen, if I want to make the snare sounds extended, I might kind of do what I'm doing here, where the release time is kind of slower and it kind of recoils as the snare sound dies. So this might give the effect of a snare being a little bit fatter and elongated. So I'm going to turn off the plugin. And then here's the compression. Subtle, maybe less attack. Okay. Now the other thing I might do is put a slower attack time on and let the initial crack of the snare drum get by and then turn down the back end of it. And to have the release kind of like kick back before the next snare drum hits. Release is an interesting setting because it depends on the rhythm of the track. So, as an example, the snare drum going again, if my release time is too long of a release time, it's like slow release, the volume stays turned down. It doesn't have time to recoil before the next snare hit happens. So I want it to recoil all the way back to 0 before the next hit. So I'm kind of timing that out with the rhythm of the track. Also, the attack, I'm going to slow it down here. Get a little bit more crack on that snare. The front end attack of the snare might be accentuated now. So no compression, compression. To me, it sounds like there's a little bit more of the crack of the snare drum going on there. Okay, so you can do this, to kick drums is another really common instrument that you would do a similar thing on. So this one, I'm going to pull up a different plugin. This is a compressor, but it's modeled after a 1176 compressor. It's like a analog piece of gear that studios that can afford to have analog gear everywhere have. It's kind of like a classic compressor. But instead of a threshold, this has an input and an output. It's got your attack and release, and it's got buttons here for the different ratios. But the way that it works is you just have the signal going in at a certain level, and if it's turned down, like here we go with our kick comp right here. So when it's too low of an input signal, there's no compression happening. This needle is showing gain reduction, right? So I have to turn this up and start getting gain reduction up there in the ballpark of, like I said, 5 to 7 to 8 or whatever. And then I can compensate for the loss of volume by turning the output up. Now, the attack and release times on this particular plugin are kind of counterintuitive. Basically, the higher the number, that's a fast attack and fast release. And you can tell, guys, look at the needle. See how it pops real quick? That's a quick attack and quick release. Now, if I slow the release down, see how that takes a little bit longer to swing back. And if I have a slower attack, I might get a little bit more pop. So it makes a kick drum go from sounding like this. Where do I mute this? Oh, here we go. So there's my kick drum without a compressor, and then here's with the compressor. So besides making it louder, it's also a little bit more punchy. The other example of a compressor used maybe for a different reason, is on a bass. Okay, so here's a bass guitar, or it's an upright bass actually, but here is the bass track, and what I'm trying to do with the bass is make the notes longer. So I'm trying to get elongated notes. More sustain. So the way I would do that is kind of drop that threshold down, get some compression going on with the gain reduction, maybe a quick attack and a release that's kind of a little bit slower, a little bit of output gain boost, and then let's compare. So here's no compression, so the note kind of died there, it doesn't sustain. But with the compressor on, see how the note kind of kept going. So it's a way of elongating those notes and adding sustain. So compression, just to wrap things up, the key things you have are threshold, which is the setting point at which it starts to cause the compressor to turn things down, right? It's like a robot arm turning things down. Attack and release, these are the times and the speeds at which it jerks the volume down slowly or fast and recoils. Output is how you compensate and turn the volume up of something. Like after you've compressed it, made it quieter, you turn up that volume to kind of compensate for that. And also a lot of times you want to make your tracks louder and bigger and more poppy. So compressors and compression is a great tool to like bring up the volume of your whole mix. And you can do this on the master, like on a sub mix where it's like all the tracks are going to this one track and you compress it to get it louder. Or you can do it on individual tracks or groups of instruments and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, hopefully that helps. And that's today's lesson on compression. So good luck, and we'll see you in the next video. Be sure to subscribe. We'll see you next time. Cheers.